Hello chess fans, welcome back to my series on the Nimzo-Indian defense. Today we're going to discuss the Kmoch variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. So after d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, bishop b4. We know that this is the Nimzo-Indian defense. If you want the details and the ideas of the first three moves, the moves that I just showed you on the screen, watch my previous videos. I explain all the small details and move orders and why we play the moves that we do. So here we know that the main idea is that white wants to play e4. However, because of this pin, white is unable to do so. So white prepares it with this move, pawn to f3. This is called the Kmoch variation. And after pawn to f3, we have three ways to play against this. One of them you just saw, it's pawn to d5. Another one is pawn to c5. And the last one is castles. So we will discuss all three of these moves. My personal recommendation is going to be pawn to c5. I think this gives you very stable and straightforward positions. They're very similar to Benoni positions, but because of the bishop already being on b4, they're actually improved versions of Benoni positions. Okay, but let's start with, let me remove the arrows. Let's start with pawn to d5. After pawn to d5, white plays a3. We take on c3, damaging white's structure. B takes c3, and we push the pawn to c5. Here, white takes on d5, and we have two ways to recapture this pawn on d5. We can either take it with the knight or with the pawn. Taking with the queen is not very good, but these two are both playable. Let's discuss taking with the knight first. I think this one is more complicated. This is not the one I would recommend if you want to play these lines specifically, just because how complicated these positions can get. As you can see in this position after knight d5, we are attacking this pawn on c3, and there is no good way to defend it directly. Like for example, if you play bishop d2 or something, you already lose this pawn on d4. g3, queen takes d4, the pawn is lost. So there are really no great ways to defend this, but white defends this pawn tactically with d takes c5. So now if we take on c3, white can exchange the queens and black cannot castle anymore. So that is why this pawn is defended through, I guess, either tactically or you can call it like a positional threat, I guess. So here, black plays queen a5, typical move because d takes c5 was played. Queen a5 attacks both of these pawns, and here white plays this move e4. Now in this position, we don't really want to take on c3. If we take it with the queen, first and foremost, we run into bishop d2. That's not good. This is defended, this is attacked, and this is attacked. So both knight and the queen are under attack, and we cannot defend both. Well, we can try a move like queen e5. However, this eventually is going to run into a position where we're down on development and our position is not great. So that is not something we want to do. And also we don't want to take this pawn with c3 because of queen d2. And there are various issues on this diagonal now, which we were supposed to be attacking on this diagonal. However, white is attacking us on the same diagonal, which is quite strange, but this is how chess works. So here we actually retreat to f6, and after a move like bishop e3, developing, we castle the king. White plays queen to b3, also developing. We play knight d7. The reason why we play this knight to d7 and not this knight, not the b knight, is because of this idea queen b4, and this knight in a lot of lines is necessary to go to c6. For example, here the move would be queen to c7, and after, let's say, knight to e2 or move like that, we would be able to go knight c6 attacking the queen if we took with the other knight. So that's why we need to take with the we need to go back with the f, not take, sorry, this is an empty square. We need to go back with the f knight. So that is what we do. Here white plays a4, a very strange move. However, it is quite smart because white is preparing queen a3 in some lines to defend the pawn like this. Also, the pawn still cannot be taken on c5 because queen b4 is kind of a fork. So first of all, the queen cannot retreat because obviously we would lose the knight. So black is forced to take the queen, which fixes white's pawn structure here. Now the pawns are on a4 and b4. The pawn structure is good. White can continue developing and will have a slightly better position due to better development. So here, after a4, we need to retreat with the queen. White plays queen to a3, justifying this a4 move. However, these moves are crazy complicated, and your opponents will definitely not know all of these moves. However, I still would not recommend going into this d5 line because there's so many continuations and there's so many ways white can deviate into a different position that I don't think is worth it. I think there's a much more straightforward way to handle these positions. So going back, instead of taking with the knight here, if you really want to play this d5 line, I would recommend taking with the pawn and going into this one. After e3, white castles, bishop d3 by black castles, bishop d3 by white, b6, bishop to a6, so we're trying to trade off the bishops here, castles, rook e8, continuing the development, knight to g3, bishop takes d3, queen d3, knight c6, and we have various ideas in this position. After bishop b2, for example, this is where my analysis ends, but you can continue in multiple different ways. You can continue with knight a5, knight c4, you can go h5, h5, h4 to kick the knight out, you can continue with c4, and then maybe like a knight a5, knight to b3. So there's many ways you guys can continue this position. It's very tough though. White scores quite well in this structure, but I think it's better to go into this rather than the other variation, just because the other one is so complicated. You have to know all sorts of different ideas. But to be honest, I would not recommend going into either one. Okay, after bishop b2 here, as I said, the general middle game plans are knight a5, knight c4, or pawn to c4, h5, h4. Okay, now going back to this position, so let me now show a different one. Here we discussed d5, now we're going to discuss castles. So castling, in my opinion, is also not the most testing response. After a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, we play d5 again, takes, pawn to e3, we play pawn to c5, and we are going to basically transpose into the exact same position, right? Bishop d3, b6, knight e2, bishop to a6. Well, in this line I have bishop takes a6, but if white castles, we are basically transposing into this line where, as I said here, knight c6, bishop b2, we have all of these different ideas as I just explained earlier. So it is the same exact line, just played from a different move order. However, in the other line, if you go with the d5 move first, so after f3, d5, you have an extra option of taking with the knight. So here, after c5 takes, knight, you can take with the knight. And the reason why you can take with the knight here is because you haven't castled, so you're one tempo faster. But these lines are very similar. If you take with the e-pawn, you will transpose. If you take with the knight, you go into that super complicated line that I explained earlier. Regardless though, there is another way to play the Kmoch variation of the Nimzo-Indian. And let me show you that one. I'm not going to go into more detail in this one because I already talked about it since it transposes. So here, after f3, the move that I would recommend to you is c5, and this goes into Benoni-like structures. So after d5, we castle the king, white plays e4, so we allow e4, and then we play d6. So we allow e4, but we cannot allow e5, so d6 is a measure against e5. We need to stop that. And here there are two moves that I want to talk about. The most played move by masters is knight to e2. But the move that you will likely face most in your games will be bishop to d3. So I will start with bishop to d3. And here you play a very cool move. If you are a Benko or a Benoni player, this move should come to mind because it is one of the ideas that makes Benko and Benoni work, and it's super cool. And the move that I'm talking about is b5. So we are sacrificing this b pawn, and this is one of the most sound sacrifices that you can make. Like sacrificing this b pawn is absolutely great. This type of sacrifice is what the Benko gambit is based on. However, here it's an improvement because of the bishop on b4, because in a lot of lines when you're playing Benoni or Benko type of positions, the bishop is either on e7 or it's fianchettoed on g7, and that's not really as good as having it on b4. On b4 it's way more active, quicker, right? Because g6 bishop g7 takes more time, and e7 is just not very active. So we go bishop b4 in one move, and then we have a lot of pressure. We can set the position up like a Benoni. So here, let's say that our opponent accepts the gambit, takes on b5. What we do is we take on d5, e takes d5. I know you guys are looking at this move right now, taking this pawn because there's a pin. However, this allows a lot of tactical sequences with bishop to h7, and this is not what you want to do. Instead, the move that I would recommend is pawn to a6. So fully gambiting this pawn, and after takes, I would even recommend a really cool move. So here, you can gambit another pawn with c4. And the idea of this is that after bishop takes c4, we play queen to c7. Queen to b3 is the move recommended by the computer. And after we take on a6, bishop takes, knight takes, we're defending the bishop on b4. And after knight to e2, we are playing queen b6. This is a very important move. Queen b6 or queen c5, they're both playable, but their idea is the same. I would prefer b6 though, because I want to have this square available for the knight. The idea is that we are disallowing the king from castling, and basically white is going to play without this rook, and that is your compensation for the two pawns that we sacrificed, the b and a pawns. And this might look very dangerous to you because you might be thinking, okay, I'm down 2 pawns, how can I use this? But in chess, never be afraid to sacrifice, okay? If you go for a sacrifice of pawns and you have compensation, but you end up losing the game, you will learn from it, okay? You should analyze that game, and next time you will be able to prevail in your endeavor of going for these crazy sacrifices. And I think that this is one of the most venomous positions that you can play down 2 pawns. This is extremely dangerous for the white pieces. So I would recommend analyzing this position more in your own time. But the ideas are generally putting the rook on e8, putting the knight on c5. This knight will most likely go to d7 because white will play, let's say, bishop to g5. You will reroute this knight to d7, let's say like rook d1, knight to c5, queen c2, and you're playing this position that is extremely difficult to play for your opponent. Like knight a4 already puts more pressure, rook c8 is going to put more pressure on the knight. This king still cannot castle, and the position is unbelievably difficult to play. Okay, there is one last line that I want to talk about, and that is knight to e2 in this position, which is the best move, basically, not bishop d3. And here we play the same thing. We play b5, and after knight to f4, we need to take on d5, and after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen d5, we actually sacrifice the rook on a8. So we play queen b6, because if queen takes on a8, we are trapping the queen with bishop to b7. So the queen cannot take the rook on a8. Instead, what white does is white plays bishop to f4, bishop e6. We are gambiting yet another pawn. So queen takes d6. However, we do not want to trade the queens here. Remember, we are pressuring the king. So we want to avoid the queen trade. We want to pressure this knight more. So here, the move that you might face is probably like rook c1. This is what you will face in your games. And here you can take the pawn on a2 because the knight's not defending it due to the pin. However, the best move is actually queen to d2. And after knight c6, king to f2, knight to d4, our knight is super active, our bishops are super active, our queen is super active. The rooks are going to get active in a move or two as well. And this position, again, is very dangerous for the white pieces, despite black being down a pawn. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't be afraid to sacrifice pawns. Make sure to learn how you have the compensation, where you have the compensation, and how to use it. So make sure you learn that, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.